Good morning. Today's Rambam, doing the third parak of Hilchas Avodim, and I'm going to deal with an issue that is very, very perplexing. And what is the Rambam's opinion? There are many different opinions on it. So let's start reading Halacha Gimel and Halacha Dalet. Misha machru bezdin yesh l'rabbi litan le Shifcha Knaanis. His master can give him a maidservant who was brought in by who was originally not Jewish, totally, and he can give it to him as a wife. He lives with a shifcha. And the kafei alzeh, he can force him to live with this lady. So that he can breed children. And others and therefore have more slaves, more Eved Knaanis. She is permitted to him as his wife, as long as he is a Jewish slave. If his master gives him this wife. So that's only for Machru Best, the Rambam says. If a person sells himself, Shifcha Knaanis k'shar kol Yisrael. He's forbidden in a Shifcha Knaanis, just like anybody else, any Jew. Then Allah Chadal, there are conditions. He has to have his own wife. He can't just, he doesn't have a wife, he can't have Shifcha Knaanis. And he has to have a wife and children. It's a very interesting halacha. You would think the otherwise, logically, no, because we don't want him really to create that marriageable relationship with this woman. He's still married. This is just for breeding avodim. Then comes another halacha. Even if the guy who sold himself as a kohen, so what? A kohen has additional problems with the shifcha. So anybody learning this Rambam should come to the conclusion that the Rambam holds that a regular Jew who's not an Eved Ivri is definitely forbidden for Shifcha Knaanis. And there's good reason to believe that, as we will see later. However, the Mishnah Lamelech, right on this halacha Gimel, that brings a marriage dam, Yeredeyasim and Kuf Tzadik Vav. According to the Rambam, a shifcha is not osur midin Torah, from Torah view, only mid Rabbanon. What is the Torah telling you? It's not talking about the halachas. It's talking about the forcing him, that he can force him to marry. That's the chiddush. The chiddush is that he has a control over him. And this Mishnah Melech is quite long, and he goes back and forth. And brings many, many proofs and refutations, and goes on to conclude. Obviously, he doesn't agree with the Rajdan, but he does have a long discussion. Some of what he discusses will come up a little later. So, again, anybody reading this Rambam, however, has to come to the conclusion, like the Mishnah Melech, that it's not a Drabanan, it's the Rais. Okay, now Well, let's read another Rambam. Hilchas Yisur Biyah, Perik Yud Beis, Halacha Yud Aleph. Rambam writes, Ha'avodim, she'edbilu eisam l'shem avdus. We know that an eved has to go through a conversion process. The kibla alei mitzvahs, sha'avodim chayavim, and they need to go through literally a conversion to being an eved. It's a status of its own, as the Rambam will explain. Sha'avodim chayavim yotzu. Now here the Rambam describes their status. Yotzu michlal ha'akum. They are not anymore non-Jews. They're not Jews. Lefichach hashifcha asura lebenchayim. That's why a shifcha is also lebenchayim. Why? Didn't say why. He just said something here. Echad shifchasei ve'eved shifchas chaver. It doesn't matter who the shifcha is. Now, so is that the Raisa? He only gets Malkus with the Reseif, Makis Magus. It's only the Rabbanon that can Makis. Look, the Rambam, what's the record to that? They don't get Malkus. Sharei Mefurish Batera. Sha'od nice Shifcha Knaanis Lavde Ivri. The Mutaris like. Since I told you in Hilchas Avodim, or I'm going to tell you that an Odain can give his Eved Ivri Shifcha Knaanis. So obviously, you can't tell me that it's us or that you get Malchus for it, or it's us or Shenamar Madain Avit Leisha. Oh, wait. And Allah continues, like Gozer Chachamim, like Chayv Malkus Shivcha, Ella in Kain Haisen Chrefes Lish. Okay, that's a different Allah. Now, let's read one more Allah. And then Allah Yud Gimel. Here's where again. Reading Halacha Yud Aleph, you need to come to a conclusion that there is it's a Rabbanan. Not like we came to a conclusion when we started off our discussion. Halacha Yud Beis Al Yihi Ovain Ze Kal Beinecho. This sin should not be light in your eyes. Nay shame with Malchus, not there because there's no Malchus. From the Torah point of view, why? Because this causes the children to not follow the ways of Hashem. Chaben and Ashivcha, who Eved, child of a Shivcha is an Eved, the enemy Yisrael, and therefore he's not a full Jew, or he's not a Jew. We'll see what that means. So he causes the holy seat to turn into avodah. Now, okay. In other words, it sounds like a philosophical understanding why it's not a good idea, which would still play in again to what he was saying. Don't take it lightly because it's not a good idea. He's not done with that. The which is an interesting expression. Unklis, the translator, kolal included Be'ilas Eved V'Shivcha B'Chlal Kadesh L'Tziyah Kadesh. He made it part of the lav of Kadesh L'Tziyah Kadesh, which is a lav that you're not allowed to have to do with somebody in a manner of casual relations. It has to be a marriage and not something that you just pick up once in a while and do, or that relate, and that's not it. So these Rambams that we just learned in Hilchas Yisur seem to be what's called in a Medrash Pliya. Seems to be like back and forth, contradictory. He seems to contradict himself. He starts off saying there's no Malkus. It's only Medivir Seifrim. It's only the Rabbanon. And then he says, Hare Unklis Hamatargim says it's a law in the Torah. Then he writes, Unklis included it in Le'iyah Kodesh. If you read Unklis, he didn't include it. He translated Le'iyah Kodesh. Now, Unklis's translation of Le'iyah Kodesh is, they say, hey, Itzum and Bnei Yisrael, Gvar Avad. Well, Yusav Guvra and Bnei Yisrael, Asa Amo. Don't marry this is not a call-out. This is not included. This is it. Now, then he says, therefore, the Shifcha is forbidden to a Ben Chayr. What do you mean she's forbidden? She's not forbidden. Therefore, they forbade him. It's a Rabbanan. Osru, not Asura. He writes, it says clearly in the Torah that the Adain can give a Shifcha Knaanis to his slave, his Jewish slave, and she's mutter. So what? We find many things that certain people are mutter, certain people are not. For instance, a Pilegesh, a king is mutter, not everybody else. It's a discussion on its own, and we've written about that, spoken about that. But nevertheless, it requires, we find other things. Then he writes, this sin should not be light in your eyes because there's no malchus in Atayah. Should have written stronger because there's no ism in Atayah. Then he writes, Shagam ze goyrim leben losem achra Hashem. Because, what does that have to do? Good. So again, if you're telling me philosophy, but the Rambam does not, doesn't sound like what he does. Now, if you want to know what he is referring to, a little before that, in the same paragraph, in Halacha Zion, he spoke about having relations with a non-Jewish person. So he writes, even though it does not have, there's no death penalty involved, like there is with Arayas. There's something worse than all Arayas. Person has a child from a illicit marriage. True, the child is a mamzer, but it's a child. He's a Jew. How about Bishu mamzer? Yeah, he's a tainted Jew, but he's a Jew. A ben from Akusa is not his child. Not considered his child. Not yours. And then he continues with this causes terrible consequences of Jews interacting with Goyim. Separated us. And it causes a rebellion against David. Okay, so there is. So this is where the Rambam is continuing. Seems to be a concept here. Regarding what the Rambam brought in Unklis, the Maggid Mishnah makes note that the Rambam himself does not agree with Unklis, because he learns that it's coming to talk about a Jew with another Jewish girl without marriage, and then there is Malchus. Whereas in a Shifcha and a Kus, there's no Malchus. So the Radvaz says that, again, same thing. And he claims clearly, Rambam that it's all midrabanan. And Lisi Kadesha is not, has nothing to do with Evan Shifcha. I fact that Radvaz, the Rambam and Hilches, Yisur via references unclears. So the Teretz is not because he agrees with him. He's just trying to bring out these lahaflik be'isur shifcha to show you how terrible it is that there are those who even say that that's the law of the Kadesh. But of course, there's nothing to talk about. So they all seem to follow the pattern that the Marshdam that says that we're talking about Isur Rabbanan. Okay. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. This massive sugya. I don't want to belittle it by just skipping over everything, but we have the time constraints, and we're going to skip over everything. I would like to suggest two possibilities how to understand the Rambam. They're not, bombshells that open up the idea that's great, but what to think about, something to give us to think about. One is there's something. What is a shifcha? What's her status? So the Rambam has defined the status. Yotzu michlal hakim l'chal Yisrael lo yibou. So we have to understand, what is this? Does it mean exactly the way the word's seen, that there is a half status, a mixed breed of Jew and non-Jew in this person? And as there are indications in possibility that it makes sense to say that. So therefore, since it has both, since it has both, it has both in it. It has she. Or do we say no? She's like in between. She's like in limbo. In limbo, state of limbo. Not here, not here. Something new. Some new entity called a Shifcha Knaanis. So again, either we say she's a new entity, or do we say that, no, she's both. She has Judaism and non-Judaism. Okay. Should we say the second way, that she's, what I just repeated, the second way, that there are both Judaism and non-Judaism in her? She's a mixed breed. So then we can say that she has an Isser of Zayn on her because she's partially both. Even though she's not what the Rambam usually refers to an Isser Pnuya Yisrael, because she's not totally Yisrael, but she's partial Pnuya Yisrael. So you can't give a Malchus. You can't give Malchus. Now, I'm not talking about, we have a concept called Chatzi Shifcha, Chatzi Bascher. Here, it's not Chatzi Shifcha, Chatzi Bascher. It's not a half. It's a mixed. It's a mixture. Since it's a mixture, and every part of her, so to speak, is both, so you can't give Malchus, but there is that aspect. So therefore, Isser of Pnuya Yisrael will still be, but Malchus you can't give. If that's the case, there's no steer in the Ram. You don't have to say that he's only saying it lahaflik. But and that's why he's saying there's no Malchus, but there's an Isser. And that's why he writes Unklis Amatargim Kolal Bilas ever the Shifcha Knaanis. In other words, even though he holds it includes it, that's the way he translates the pasuk. But the Rambam himself translates it much greater, that it refers to Pnuya. So he's just showing from him that this shifcha is included in this, and he perhaps learns that that's the law. It's included in it because of the fact that she has the Jewishness in her. And that's why he writes that she's not, that we didn't make the Isser. It's Isser D'Oraisa. It's an Isser Pnuya. We find that the Torah, the Rambam writes, that he brings as a raya that there's no Malchus. It's more likely that if it were a full blown Isser, it's a status of a mixed person, a mixture. So therefore, it's not so chomer, and that's why Torah allowed it. So that's why he doesn't write that. Don't let this law be light in your eyes because shame by Isser. It's similar to what he wrote before. There's even no Misa, there's no Isser. And that will take care of other issues, but the only thing it doesn't explain is why did he get into this that this causes the child to be removed from Me'achei Hashem, unless just there is maybe lahaflig is like the other writes. Okay, it's still. I mean, I guess he's just stressing the chaymer. You should realize it. That's one approach. In other words, the approach is that the Issa that we're dealing with is the Issa of Pnuya L'Yisrael. But it's a partial Pnuya. Not even a partial, it's a mixed Pnuya. She's mixed to being a Pnuya and an Ak. And therefore, you can't get Malchus, but shouldn't happen. Because a lav exists. You're doing something wrong. That's number one. And it will also answer one of the biggest problems with saying it's a Rabbanon, because the Gemara says, and the Rambam brought that halacha, that even a kohen is okay. And the Gemara seems to ask, what's the svara that a kohen should be okay? Because even the hutra. But there's no hutra, there was no isra. Oh, you matter. And for sure, a kohen, regular kohen can't take a shifcha. So that would fall into a lot of things work out if you assume that it's again. It's not the assumption of many of the Mefarshim, but it is the assumption of the Mishnah Melech and others too. So the issue would be an issue of Kadesh. Perhaps we can look at it from another angle, another approach. That when the Rambam brings this inyan of the fact that you're losing the child, Me'achei Hashem, perhaps the Rambam learns that's the Isser. And that's what he's stressing. Similar to what he said before, that the law about marrying a non-Jewish person is because the child is lost from Judaism. And that's the law of the Torah. Lashon that to cause children. That itself is osur. And that's what's the Torah forbids. Ki yosas binchem achrei. The Torah is telling you don't do it. So this is the same idea. That's why he brings it here. The fact that there's no malchus is not negaya. Because this is the problem. This is the Yisr. And that's what he is saying. You'll ask me a question. this is only good for Yisrael Habal Akum, but what about Akum Habal Bas Yisrael? Your child is Jewish, so what's the issue? The same thing with an Eved. And the answer is because it's Kairim Hefkeris. That's what that's the issue by Akum, that's the issue by Eved. Lidovik Mak. Besides the fact that the child is not Jewish, there's also another problem. It's Kairim Lidovik. And that will happen by Eved, that will happen by Yisrael. Yeah. And that's what we learn it out. And that's the problem. So that's why the Rambam is comparing these two halachas. It's the same idea. He brings Unklis. Unklis is talking like the Radvas. And again, everything else fits because when he writes Asur leben, the Lefich Shifcha Asur leben Chayrin, it's like also. What does he want? Again, the same thing that he writes. The fact that Shemafurish retires Sha'od Nice Shifcha Knaanis agree. That's to tell you that there's no Malkus. And the same thing, anybody Isser, all that fits. And that would at least give us an insight why he is telling us this whole story about Shegamzel Geirim Leben Losam Hashem. So now we can, therefore, going back to our original Shaila, Yotzim Mechlalak and Chalisol, you can say it's a new state. It's not a mixed state. It's a new state of being. So basically, I just want to summarize. In the idea of what is the status of a shifcha, we can learn two ways. We can learn that she's a new being, or she's a mixed being. If we say she's a mixed being, then we can say that the Isser of L'Siyah Kadesha and L'Yah Kadesh exists by her, although not the Malkus aspect. If we say that it's a new breed, then we have to learn. We can learn that the Isser is equal for the fact that the child is not going to be Jewish, or in the case of an Eved with a Jewish girl, the Isser will be that Meisem Achre Hashem. Two different things that Rambam mentions all the time. So either way, we could learn that there is a mocker for this Isser. And again, we would always have to say that the Rambam's point of view is that don't focus on the Malkus. And the reason the proof that there is no Malkus is because otherwise the Torah would never have allowed to marry. You'd have to learn the way that Rambam says. Anyway, thank you very much. Hatzlacha Rabbah. And that is just a suggestion in how to understand this Rambam, which is really perplexing if you try to mix the two together. But it does seem from this halacha very strongly that there is an Isser, that there is some Isser, so that would at least give us some room to understand. Zaygalat.